chat, because we're just going to give everyone a couple of minutes to join, and then we'll kick off.
And I was being unusually quiet.
All right, I think we'll make a start. Welcome everyone to the February edition of the CREI webinar series. I'm Anna Remington, I'm the director of CREI, and it's really wonderful to see so many of you on this call today. As lots of you may already know, here at the Centre for Research in Autism and Education, we are a team of autistic and non-autistic staff and students based within the UCL Institute of Education and part of the Department of Psychology and Human Development. We aim to conduct high quality, cutting edge research, but also to ensure that the results of that research reach those who stand to benefit from them. The CREI webinar series is one aspect of that, allowing people both within and beyond academia to hear from some of the key researchers, practitioners, and advocates in the field. Through everything that we do, we take a participatory approach, which means that we work with autistic people in all stages of our research and initiatives, from the initial design right through to the sharing of the outcomes. We hope that this means that the work that we do is meaningful for the autistic community. At this point, I'd like to say a big thank you to all our funders, supporters, and team members who contribute to our work and make it all possible. In particular, a special thank you to Pears Foundation for their generous, ongoing support that underpins everything that we do. Now, enough about CREI, and on to today's speaker. I'm delighted to introduce our very own Dr. Brian Irvine. Brian works here at CREI as a postdoctoral researcher on our ESRC-funded project looking at autistic superior perceptual capacity. He was recently awarded his doctorate from ASA, the University of Birmingham's Autism Centre for Education and Research, where he investigated specialist autism mentoring in higher education. He has also mentored at Royal Holloway, part of the University of London, where over the last decade he has had the pleasure of regular meetings with many brilliant students as they journeyed through their university life. We at CREI benefit so much from Brian's thoughtful, innovative, and supportive approach to research, so I'm thrilled that so many more of you will get to experience that today. You are all very welcome to put questions for Brian in the Q&A box, and I will ask him as many as possible at the end. You can also post these questions anonymously if you prefer. And now I'm delighted to hand over to Brian, who will be talking today about framing and reframing specialist autism mentoring in UK higher education institutions.
You're delighted. I'm delighted. It's the first time I've been introduced as Dr. Brian. Now, I've been a mentor for a while, and it does feel like I've kind of crossed the bridge. And I've got still to come to terms with this somehow. But hopefully, you're now in for a nice 45 minutes long about what specialist autism mentoring in higher education. Anna, thank you. Now, sharing screens. Hopefully, you can all now see my screen up there. Let me introduce myself. As Anna said, I've been a researcher in specialist autism mentoring in higher education at ASA in Birmingham, where I defended my thesis just a fortnight ago. It's weird for a mentor, that changing of roles within an institution. I've also recently started here, up in the attic. That is my little office at CREI, the UCL Centre for Research in Autism Education. I really hope I got that one right. To start with, to describe myself, for those of you who don't have your screens on, I'm a bespectacled, bearded man with a passing resemblance to Santa. I've worked for the last century as a secondary school teacher. No, not the last century, in the last century. I spent 5 years as an early years practitioner. I've been a primary autism teacher in an inclusion unit, and I've just spent a decade working in higher education as a specialist autism mentor with many, many university students. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's happening in our higher educations. I'm going to talk a little bit about what goes on backstage with both the mentees and the mentors. I'm going to talk about how we negotiate salience, how we negotiate meaning. I'm going to unpack some of the practices of us practitioners and how we set about making spaces of safety for our students. There's going to be an arc, hopefully. I'm going to say hopefully, I'm really bad at sticking to scripts. I'm going to start with some of the numbers of mentoring. I'm going to go a little bit of context. I'm going to talk a little bit about wisdom, or at least for myself, a passing facsimile of wisdom. I'm going to talk about the double empathy probing that is at the heart of a negotiated reframing. And then I'm going to end up with 3 elements to consider as part of your mentoring practice. Without further ado, I'm going to point you in this direction. So hopefully you can grab your phone. If you point it at your screen, it will take you to a link tree. Now, at this link tree, there are links to some of the papers I will talk about. There are links to these slides themselves, things that you can take away. It'll also have my contact details. You can follow me on Twitter. It's a useful place just to get some contact going. For a starting point for this talk, I'm going to start with a declaration. Autistic university students belong. And I've got a graph to show it. There are a lot more autistic university students than there used to be. Now, this graph has a rising boom. If you look all the way down to the bottom corner, you will see a tiny, tiny, tiny little pixel, which tells us that in 2003, there were 80 autistic students in the entire of the United Kingdom. This then just goes up and up and up until this graph's got the 2021 figures. Just in the first year alone, there were 5,130 autistic students, which meant that there was about 16,685 autistic students in total at university in the year, of whom 2,006 were postgraduate students. Now, with this 16,600 or so students, if you put them all together in one place, you would have a university that was fully autistic and the size of Reading University. It would be about the 60th biggest university in the UK. It would be bigger than 120 other universities. That's an awful lot of autistic students who are finding success at university. If you are autistic, you belong to universities, no ifs or buts. Universities themselves should hopefully be going beyond simple inclusion. They are radically neurodiverse communities and they should be embracing it. Now, one of the supports that happens in the UK, and it really is just the UK, for all disabled students is the DSA, the Disabled Students Allowance, an absolute gem of a policy. Policy I'm sometimes worried about talking about, just in case bean pushers, bean counters take it away. But gem of a policy, for the last decade, assessors have been recommending that the DSA funds specialist autism mentors like myself for autistic students. Most autistic students who have mentoring for 1 or 2 meetings a week through the Student Finance England, who pay for it, which is nice. I will say this, I'll get this right round to it when I talk about my methodology. I did ask Student Finance England what they knew about these students that they pay for. The answer's not a lot. It's likely that from that number of 16,600 or so students, only about 55% of them get mentoring. There are some studies out there. There's a lovely one by Lucas and James who say that the provision that is specialist autism mentoring is incredibly useful for the students. They value it and they credit it for the course persistence, which leads me to another lovely number. Completion rates of autistic students. 85% of autistic students completed their studies, compared to 86% for the predominant neurotype, and 79% for students with a mental health need. Now, considering the overlap between autism and some mental health needs, 84% isn't too shabby. There is room for improvement, but it does mean that something is going right. So with this growth in higher education and these good enough rates of completion, I'd like to introduce you to a framework for reframing that might underpin what we all do as specialist autism mentors. If you are not a specialist autism mentor, I do believe that a lot of what I might talk about is generally applicable. That actually the lessons that we learnt with our students with a superior perceptual capacity allow us to refine our own practice of being mentors in whatever state we find ourselves. I'm going to start with a mapping of the university itself. What university should be planning for? So this is less for mentors, more if you're a disability officer, if you've got any VPs around. Universities, at the moment, all across the UK, there are about 900 mentors at UK HEIs. It's not uniform. We have some in some places, some in the others, some that work as sole traders, some that work for social enterprise companies, some that work for non-medical health companies, and the majority seem to be working for universities themselves. But only 55% of autistic students get the mentoring support. So we probably need another 800 or so mentors in the UK. And we need to find ways to recruit and make sure that these are mentors who can bring their own lived experience to the profession itself. We also know that there are moves afoot to truncate the DSA, the Disabled Students Allowance that pays for this. It's going to be a bit of negotiation over the next few years. I passionately believe that what we do as specialist autism mentors complements the universal design for learning that is being pushed. We do need universities that are accessible for everyone, but we also have to bear in mind that there are individuals, people among us, who need that extra care because of the layers, the lamentations of minoritization that they encounter on a daily basis. Before we talk about mentoring in the specific, I just have a big question. And the big question I quite often put is, what is a mentor? People ask me this and I do blink a couple of times before I answer. If you say what's a teacher, we all kind of know what a teacher is. We kind of know what the teacher does. If we ask what a mentor is, we kind of have a sort of hazy idea. Maybe it's a businessman with a young protege. Maybe it's a wise old doctor taking the young cardiac surgeon under the wing. Maybe it's levels of teaching. I don't think any of these really encapsulate what's going on. To start with mentoring, I'm going to take us right back. I'm going to take us back to the mythos, to the legends. Mentor was a character in Homer's Odyssey, and he was left behind to help Odysseus's son, Telemachus, to navigate staying at home, looking after an empire, becoming the new king. Mentor himself was occasionally, well, 3 times, he was embodied by the spirit of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, would actually enter Mentor's body, and 3 times Mentor guides that stories. I will point out, just in case this sounds a little bit grandiose, that Athena turns up in a seagull at one point, which technically means I'm worth 3 seagulls. I can live with that. That original legend gets picked up in the 16th century in, I suppose we could call it a fanfic by Fenelon, which is called Telemachus and Mentor. The Adventures of Telemachus. And it is about Telemachus and Mentor going and having escapades. In fact, the picture you see here is from President Andrew Jackson's Hermitage. And he had this put up here as this great story about a young king growing into his role. The particular scene that I've got up here is Mentor saving Telemachus from the naughty nymphs. And he does so by taking Telemachus and lobbing him off a cliff. I think there's something quite fundamental in mentoring about this kind of robust approach. It's the story from which we get the idea of a mentor being about support, about care, about wise counsel, and admittedly cliff chucking. It models a fairly egotistical young man growing into a model ruler. Again, getting good rulers by chucking them off of cliffs. I can do that. This story from the 16th century then gets picked up in the 17th century. The great mystic and educator Fenelon, his book gets picked up in Rousseau's Emile. Now, I don't know if any of you have looked back at this core work about what it means to be a teacher, what it means to be an educator. But Emile and Sophie are given one book to read during the entire rambling through the forests and learning about stuff. And this book happens to be The Adventures of Telemachus, the son of Ulysses. It gets picked up as that old idea that education is about becoming your own leadership, becoming into the position of your own leadership. I quite like that Ulysses' hope that Telemachus can, here's a phrase, grow into offices of tenderness. So that's Alfred Lord Tennyson in the 19th century, wrote a big poem, growing into offices of tenderness. That's not just offices as the place we go to work, but also the roles that we have, and having that idea of tenderness at the heart of it. Now, mentoring kind of disappears at that point. Late Victorians, what do you say? It then re-emerges in the 20th century via the self-help movement of the 70s, but then becomes very quickly shackled to the workplace. In the 80s, mentoring moved from business to a model of teaching, how to teach nurses, how to teach doctors, how to teach teachers. The 90s saw it swing back into the corporate world, and it became a tool for justice. And it straddled the marginalisation of women and race through a concern for building self-efficacy and confidence. That whole idea of knowing you belong because there's someone already there and they have your back. The noughties see it swing back again, and mentoring becomes more about the individual rather than the corporate need, and actually finds a place in youth mentoring at that point. Out of all of this, there is one particular model that appears, and it's called Galbraith and Cohen's complete mentor model. Now, I have a problem with this because it puts the mentor, not the mentee, at centre stage. And a lot of the work that you'll find on mentoring comes back to Galbraith and Cohen, the mentor model. So to shift this paradigm, I wanted to do some research. So instead of starting with mentors, I went to mentees. I asked 14 mentees to be my autistic hypothesizers. I mean, I'm a bit of a numpty. I didn't really know what research questions to follow. I did know that they shouldn't be mine, that I should succeed that power over. I should give that power over to autistic students themselves to find what direction research should go. That participatory core right at the beginning. To do this, I have some great questions. I had a question like this. This was one of my favorite ones from Hazel. All names are pseudonyms unless chosen otherwise. Do you actually understand us as autistic students, or do you just listen? Oh, I love that one. That is really about growing into offices of tenderness, becoming a place where you can talk and be open, about how to negotiate the double empathy problem. Let me give you a quick portrait of a mentoring session. Student arrives, shall we say, so they arrive looking stressed. The first thought as a mentor is, actually, is this anything more than just the stress of negotiating a corridor? Is it just the fact that it's a Tuesday? And so you ask. They tell you they've received their first. Well, hey, excellent. You ask because they don't seem as elated as you are for them. They tell you that they've got to worry, that if they tell their mum, she's going to go and do that whole loop thing with it. You know, oh, you got a first. Oh, you got a, did you get a first? Oh, you got a first. Oh, there's a first. Oh, did you hear my daughter got a first? Oh, you got a first. Over and over again, remembering that essay and pulling on the pressure for the next one. There's concerns about feeling exposed, the layers of expectation that success has done, but it's still a first. So as a mentor, you celebrate. And then you peel it back. You discuss what might happen if they don't have that chat with their mum for a month or two. What happens if mum don't find out? It's not a problem. I mean, your mum might just go a bit, but actually, you should be really glad you got first anyway. You suggest that as an opening gambit in negotiation for moving. Well, yeah, if you've got to, a couple of months' time, talk to mum about maybe moving into halls, telling her about your success at that point can be really worth it for you. So you then talk about, well, are you now hoping to move into halls? And yeah, so you ask them to paint you a picture of what they expect living in halls to be like. What's it going to be like living off campus or on campus? What is it going to be about that corridor navigation that we started with? We suggest that you meet next time, maybe not in the office, but actually having a wander around the local town to see what accommodation is there, having a little wander around the campus to see what kind of housing might evoke a picture of independence. That is a whole process about asking to understand. But, and I will say this, Jake, the lovely Jake, comes back to us as a mentor and says, sometimes I understand and sometimes I just try. And despite all this, I'm a proponent of humility at the heart of mentoring, a robust humility, one that says, yes, I don't know anything. Let me find out. Not one that just goes, oh, I'm a bad person. Not that kind of humility. The kind of humility that is the starting point of, I would say, wisdom. Humility and understanding that may be the path. We need, as mentors, not just to gather a theoretical understanding of autism. I mean, there are some great books out there. There is work authored and produced by autistic researchers, really incredibly valuable. There will be our own professional experience. Many of us will have been in this job for decades. And actually, we will have had autistic students come to us and say, Brian, I tried this, it worked. Brian, I tried this, not this time. We can share those things around. We have also that experience of hearing an appreciation of what NatSav, I love some of the pseudonyms, what NatSav termed the full impact that challenges have on any one individual. We will have sat with students and we will have cried with them. We would have got frustrated on behalf of those students. We have those long-term relationships where we can see sometimes just how hard things are. And we can spend that time trying to understand and sometimes just trying. There's a value in active listening, not planning what the next mentoring move is, being in the moment, extending, creating and cultivating empathy. And then proffering what Lady Bigfoot in the study called bespoke and evidence-based support, fitting it to the student, looking at resources, seeing what works, trying it and then trying it again. This is a space for bold humility, for robust humility. Autistic or allied alike, we need to know that first, we don't know. The mentoring relationship that emerges can then become a template for other sustaining relationships throughout our lives. It's a negotiated relationship. It unfurls backstage from the hurly-burly. Two people meet and understanding can be forged. So if we have this fearless, this brave, this humble, this bold humility, if we have this mentoring, how do we actually go about it? That, I suppose, was the questions that I pulled out, or that were given to me by the autistic advocates, the autistic hypothesizers in the project. Looking at this thing that is backstage, one of the core ideas right at the heart of this, it came from Claire about this whole idea about reframing the student's experience of themselves. Students, they can sometimes feel that they've failed because they're holding themselves up to horrible, ableist, normative standards. So there's a space in our universities to look at things differently, to find out values, to find out how awesome they are, rather than punishing themselves. This, I think at the heart of it, has a removal of barriers. I did a systematic review looking at what had been written about autism in university. There's a link to it when we get round to the link tree at the end. There are 264 papers from 13 countries giving 106 recommendations by mainly academics for university. 78 of those papers actually have autistic people speaking in them. Only 8 of those papers are about specialist autism mentoring. So the research I had to do was working with very little to start with. Time for a methodology bit. Okay, I did lots of stuff. I don't know if it's good practice, but if you have a methodological toolkit, sometimes you just append it, dump it all out, and you see what seems to work. So I started off with the literature, the autistic accounts of university. I then asked autistic hypothesizers to create things for diaries. These diaries I then collected from mentors and mentees over a year. I added in some semi-structured interviews. I did a scoping review of provisions and a freedom of information from SFE. I took all of this and I gave it to what became my forum of mentors. So in the diaries, there were 5 mentors who I thought, oh, you're a bit good. And so I looked up to see, because they disclosed their own neurodivergence at that point. And so the 5 master mentors, 3 of them were autistic themselves, autistic autism mentors. With myself, I'm what's called an AFANT. I have no pictures in my head. Possibly that's why the slides are always black. So we had this neurodiverse majority in a group that then took all the different things and discussed them. So it wasn't just me trying and coming up with them. From this, I then developed a framework for reframing. I want to thank everybody who guided me on this journey. It's not a one-man show, and it was, yeah, they are fantastic. Oh, the QR code there, if you want to click it, will take you through to the systematic review. While you're doing that, I'm just going to maybe push us ahead. We're going to talk about what appeared in three big ways, and then the last way we're going to split that into 3 ways again. So moving on, 3 domains. As a mentor, you need to have a bit of knowledge. You've got to have a bit of the operational, and you've got to have this skill, this technique of reframing. So the knowledge, that's what mentors and mentees told me, what they had learned about the autistic experience of university. The operational is more what the universities are for and how we as mentors navigate our way through these behemoths to try and make sure that good outcomes happen. And then reframing is the craft that we practice on a weekly basis to help people think about their own thoughts. Now, I know you can't see any of those little bits, which is why we're going to zoom into them one at a time. I'm going to start with the operational. I love this one. It was named by a mentor as the pokeball of practicality. Right at the center of that is this whole idea of being able to provide whatever is needed at the time. So there's that bit, student comes to you, you have got to rely on your own accrued wisdom, your own accrued knowledge, to react in that time, to be able to try and navigate any double empathy problems, and to be able to say, what is it you really need? Is that what you really need? Let's go and sort out what you need. There's also something future focused. It's about becoming a bridge to the next destination. So university, I'm always in 2 minds about this. University does have a role in employment. and employment has a role in people's well-being long term. Maybe I'm just old and grumbly about it, but there is also something about university where you study something just for the hell of it, because it's brilliant, because it's an amazing thing to study. There's that joy of special interests that can hopefully meet studies. And that's not a bridge to the next destination. That's actually enjoying university for what it is now. His name, John Newman, talked it about the beau ideal of a rounded intellect. I like that. There is something about how we go about creating spaces of safety, and that's about negotiating boundaries. Saying, actually, we're going to talk today inside this room. I do have a log to keep, unless it's a chronic safeguarding issue, and I really have to do something about it. Actually, there are things that I might not write down because you don't want me to, and it's all negotiated. There's an appreciation of the heterogeneity that actually, once you've met one autistic student, you've met one autistic student. They're all going to be wonderfully different, and it's kind of brilliant. There's something about dismantling the barriers for having a role in universities, and this is particularly for mentors who are employed by universities. I've been asked several times to go in and maybe do training. In fact, students have sometimes asked me to go in with them to critical meetings, just to make sure that they are understood and are understood in return. I've never had to go in with donuts to convince a tutor to mend their ways. Maybe it's going past my remit. If a student asked me to without prompting, I probably would. There is also the usefulness, and maybe this is what makes it okay. It's the usefulness of the mentor's character. All the mentors that I work with, they come across as wise, they come across as compassionate, they come across as caring. They are lovely, lovely people because they know that they don't know. Always a useful place to start. So those are a few of the operational things, and my thesis will be published soon if you want to go into more detail in it. I will be coming up with shortened versions just as time goes by. Next bit is the knowledge, the things you need to do. So you might see from this, apparently I'm the first person to do these kind of things. These bubbles are how many people kind of talked about each thing, each theme. So it brings a sort of quali-quanti version to it. It's all a bit rough, but it does give you some idea of the number of times that themes occurred. The big one is the lack of understanding from staff. The number of students who either told me that somebody in the department didn't understand, or mentors who had received students. So the mentors we had would have covered about 305 students between them. They told, that they had stories of a student not being able to get extensions, of not understanding what was going on, of in return, when the student tried to proffer reasons, who tried to negotiate their own learning, would actually just hit this wall of staff misunderstanding. The other bits, so that's in the barrier section. The other bit is, if you look across to successes, there's a little one which I think is a bit of a keystone. It's this whole idea of a neurodiversity positive culture. And this is just speaking as a mentor for the last 10 years. The year before COVID, I saw students with little badges that just said autistic. Little badge also that just said ADHD. And it was that kind of wearing a pin that said, I'm here. This is what I identify as. For students of that age, they would have, in the UK, they would have got a diagnosis of Asperger's. So they actually chose a word that wasn't in their diagnosis. It was a visible sign of something changing in culture. I think that is still growing, I think. Though saying that, talking to other mentors, that the post-COVID cohort, shall we say, seems to be interesting. Whether they are less fearful of doing things like not turning up because they're GCSEs they didn't have to turn up for, or whether they are actually thinking about things and making the right choices because they've seen the chaos that's gone on. I'll let you think about that one. This knowledge of success, challenge and barrier. I suppose for me, the question is, how do students respond? Students have these barriers, they have these challenges, they have these methods of success. How do they bring them together to survive and thrive? So mentors and mentees talked about that too. They talked about framing and reframing experiences. That is to say, together they look at okay, a guy called Goffman used to call these lamentations. Lamentations are something different. Laminations of experience. So you have an experience and then you build on your philosophies, you build on your beliefs, you build on your reflections and your ruminations about encounters, and you construct useful, meaningful explanations of what's going on, not just at university, but throughout your life. And this happens in the mentor and mentee partnership. And they seem to do it in three ways. They have three different ways of doing reframing. First of all is the diagnostic one. This is mainly about the mentee seeking to speak truth to power, to talk about joys, to talk about what's going right, to talk about what's going wrong. Then there's the prognostic bit, which sometimes links together, where the mentee and mentor come up with strategies to fix those things that don't quite seem right. The mentor, with our experience, we may have strategies that we've developed with other students to bring across. The mentee themselves has the lived experience, has a lifetime of working out what to do next. It's bringing that together in a way that might work. Lastly, the mentor acts as a cheerleader by passing on kindly reminders. With diagnostic, truth to power is an interesting thing. And this is why I started with the whole slight wariness of talking about mentoring, because we are involved in a process which enables students to critique the institutions they're part of. Your traditional mentoring model, yeah, your businessman, the protege, or the gold, the Rolexes, the ties with a really fat knot, all that kind of stuff, talks about making the protege fit into an institution. I hope as mentors, particularly autism mentors, I hope we prepare our students who can and are at the right stage to, I hope we prepare them to change the institutions that they are part of, to actually co-produce better arenas of learning. Within this diagnostic stage, one of the big ones is the neurodiverse frame alignment. That is to say, I would say almost all mentors talked about neurodiversity at some point, and sometimes it's just introducing that idea of the scope of human expression and experience, and actually saying being autistic is one part of just being the whole human species. We need all of them. There's neurodiverse frame alignment. It often defined issues as an outworking of Milton's double empathy problem. It was coming back to that whole idea of one group as a minority, as a neuro-minority, were not understood by, shall we call them the neuroprivileged? Those people who have never really had to think too much about who they are and how they relate to others, just because they assume everybody's like them. This diagnostic framing, in real terms, it's about talking through the week. This happened. Oh, so what happened then? Oh, well, and how's that going now? Was that nice? Yeah, do we like that kind of stuff? Sometimes it's a little bit more sort of, yeah, a student might come to you and say, I've just had, I just tried to submit an email and it got bounced back to me because I didn't add whatever was needed to get it through the particular system. And you start to name that structural injustice, naming that that bureaucracy and how that can slow things down. Sometimes it's defining academic expectations, what is needed all those kind of things that you need to do every day. That's the starting place, and hopefully you might need one or two questions to get things going, but a lot of that the student will know themselves, and it's allowing them time to process and think and frame it in words. The prognostic bit is where you start to work together. It's about overcoming the challenges. And there were so many stories in my research of students reframing things and advocating change. One of the best stories, it was COVID. There was a student and she didn't get to do one of the dissections of an owl. And so the mentor got in contact with a local owl sanctuary, and the mentee got to go and join the owl sanctuary and get some owl pellets and also have a long-term relationship with the owl sanctuary, and got to do the dissection that she missed because it was all on Zoom. It was having someone in your corner just to say, well, you know, you might not be able to do it, but there's a way to do it, and then working out the step-by-step way of getting it. Prognostic, for those of you who like your languages. Pro means towards, and gnostic means hidden knowledge. I love the idea that part of mentoring is about going towards the hidden knowledge, because there's so much unspoken curriculum out there that actually we need to have time to develop the social understanding, to create this valuing of the self through, you know, finding the different ways of doing things and how to balance things. Collaboration with a mentor and mentee, it allows some of this hidden knowledge to be made explicit. The last phrase is about motivation. The motivational side of it. Motivation at its heart is about sharing joy and valuing the passion for special interests. It's about doing those great things together, about having a space where for 20 minutes a student can tell you about the most brilliant things. And they are brilliant things. I know far more than I should about the Game of Thrones, about how everybody's related to each other. I know far more than I should about Disney princesses. I know far more than I should about geology. I know far more about the extinction of the dinosaurs. It's brilliant. There are so many amazing things out there, and my eyes have been opened to the joy of these things. So I want to thank all those students for that. You are brilliant. You've brought joy to me. And by sharing with that joy, I hope that I bring some sort of sense of reassurance that it's okay to be joyful, that there are times when it's good to have someone who understands a little bit about you and has your back. This diagnostic, prognostic and motivational model, it's a different way of thinking about what mentoring is than the traditional trying to get someone to fit into an institution model. Classic mentoring is about equipping protégés and aligning their growth to institutional goals, where a model about framing and reframing like this addresses some of the inequalities of that complete mentor model by having a mentoring. It gives agency to the mentee, who, if you are lucky, will be able to advocate for change in their own institution. Slowly. Now, the other thing that I noticed while doing this is that diagnostic, prognostic and motivational, for those sociologists amongst you, aligns with the social movements of Snow and Bedford, frame alignment theory, frame resonance and micromobilizations. That's just a very posh way of saying it's very similar to how things like Black Lives Matter, how works as an institution, how Greenpeace and Extinction Rebellion work, how the suffragettes worked, but also how things like NIMBYs and other grumps, how they bring together social movement too. Last year, a lot was being talked about in mentoring sessions about the neurodiversity paradigm and the neurodiversity framing of self-understanding within a wider institutional context. It's awesome, but mentoring doesn't have to be shackled to a particular paradigm. I've been working in this sphere long enough to know that different ideas come in. And actually having a mentoring framework that allows different emancipatory movements to be able to pick it up and run with without having to change it too much is possibly a good thing. In fact, good mentoring may not be about getting people to fit any paradigm or institution at all. It's about creating those people who will change these things. It's how we foster critical belonging. And perhaps this is why mentoring should be a model, this particular version, should be more than just in the specific context of autistic students, because at some point, you are all going to take on the mantle of mentoring. And I'd urge you to think about it in terms of mentoring as social action. Through mentoring as reframing, you will all be able to see these changing, to create plans to make things better, and to cheer for your favourite people. I want to thank you for your time today. The link tree here should take you through to expertise. I'll leave that running while I say hello, Anna.
Thank you so much, Brian.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
It was such an accessible, fascinating and engaging talk. I'm sure that all the attendees would agree with me. Absolutely brilliant. And such practical applications for all your work as well. But before I start asking you questions, I'm going to actually go to the great questions that we got posted along the way. And I'm going to start with this one. So this is your favorite part, Brian. You love the questions.
I do.
Here we go.
I have no idea what's coming. I've not planted anyone, all right?
So this question, I'm just going to read it as it was submitted. It says, I love that there is this support available to autistic students. I wish I had known about this during my recent postgrad study, 2018 to 21. What are your thoughts around how universities are working with employers to demonstrate the benefits that are being seen in further education and higher education so that mentoring for autistic adults could be replicated in some way, especially for grad or apprentice programs and with the wider employee base?
Okay, I'm not an employment specialist, so I might get the terminology wrong. There is a scheme called Access for Work. And Access for Work would provide funding, if you put it in the right kind of phrasing, for something like this. The problem is there's not enough mentors out there. In fact, there may be mentors sitting in this room thinking, oh, how do I do a bit more? Because the university nearby, I don't see enough students. If you're in that position, I think a company called Bridge Mentoring does it. I think a company called AS Mentoring used to do it. And I've got a funny feeling one of the big ones like Clarion do it as well. So it is out there. Access for Work, I think, is if I'm wrong, please correct me in the chat. I don't mind being wrong. I find being wrong joyous because that's how I find out new stuff.
We've actually got a prompt in the chat that says Genius Within also provide coaching support.
Thank you. Oh, if you are part of a mentoring thing and you want to plug yourself, please do so in the chat.
Great. So there's a few questions that have come in around your points about DSA. So the first one is, does this represent only those that have disclosed their autism and or seeking support? Yes.
So the numbers that I had, the cough, what is it, 16,600 or so, that are the number of students that disclose to their university. Rough guess that I've heard is that's probably only about 2/3 of students. So there's probably a third more than them that haven't disclosed. Of the ones that do disclose, only 55% of them get mentoring. So that probably means that only a third of the total number of students are getting mentoring. Saying that, there will be students who don't want, that's be time to stop, just in case I'm over. Some students won't want mentoring. And there's an agency in there. Actually, if you've got to university and you want to give it a punt by yourself, please do so. We're there for crisis. We'd prefer to be there before crisis. And sometimes being a bureaucracy, it takes a little while for everything to come together and the funding to arrive. Luckily, there are a lot of universities that are actually funding mentoring internally until diagnostic criteria or DSA gets sorted out. Particular shout out to Cambridge University, who doesn't apply for DSA at all, I think, and actually just funds it all internally. You know. Oh, also, I don't know what happens with the Open University. It was far too big. I didn't touch it.
And we've got some more shout outs on the chat for some mentoring schemes. One at Oxford, a neurodivergent staff and student mentoring scheme at Oxford, who were trained by the wonderful Angie at the Genius Within, and also Spectrum First. So those are two more.
It's one of those lovely things that has been occurring maybe over the last 3 years or so, in particularly with online communications and Zooms like this, where actually neurodivergent staff groups are starting to meet up with neurodivergent student groups. And I can only see that as a good thing. Yeah.
A question about the fact that you mentioned that DSA might be truncated.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's been rumbling around for 2 years or so now. There's been some reviews that are pushing for universities to be more aligned with universal design. They keep saying universal design for learning. I do want to point out that if it's universal design for learning, it's not universal, it's only about learning. So some sort of universal design, which then shifts the responsibility back on the students. It's going to be, like whenever you get any idea of universal design, there will always be people that will need the extra, and actually having room for the extra is part of universal design. There we go.
Another question about DSA. Is it acceptable for DSA to appoint an autism mentor who is based elsewhere in the country and cannot meet the student face to face?
Acceptable is the interesting word. I would prefer not to. That there is something about real life meetings which help students feel like they belong in an institution. And in fact, I would highly recommend that most mentors out there get yourself something tweedy to wear, something that makes you look like you're part of an institution, maybe a university scarf. If you turn up wearing one of those, they think, oh, I've got this lovely wise person who's part of this, who's telling me I belong as well. And there's something really, really important about that. Saying that, I am a pragmatist. Sometimes there aren't enough mentors to go around. Sometimes we just have to do it a little bit more remote. It's not the end of the world, but having the option would be nice.
Yes. A slightly different question now. This one says, I love your definition of motivation. What if a mentor does not share the joy of the student? Should mentors be specialist in the subject the student is studying, or at least be able to share some joy in it?
It's part of that. I had one mentor refer to it as weaponized optimism. This whole idea that there are some things out there in the world that will become better. That actually, even if you have a knowledge of parasitic wasps, the things I learned about parasitic wasps. I didn't go in there thinking, I want to learn about parasitic wasps, but I was told about parasitic wasps in such a contagious way, a way of enthusiasm. I couldn't help to be drawn into it and see what this young person would do with the rest of their life. And it's that finding that optimism. Now, if I'm particularly Brian. I'm a little bit, Anna has to work for me. Can you see the smile? I'm excitable about most things. And part of that is about the authenticity of being a mentor. I took my excitement for things there. You may well have your own ways of being excited about things. And just being excited alongside and for these special interests. There is no better way.
A question here broadening out a bit beyond autism. It says, I'm finding that a lot of female students are diagnosed with ADHD but struggle to get a diagnosis for autism, so are self-diagnosing. Yeah. Are these agencies for neurodiverse students or just those with an autism diagnosis?
There is a capability for the DSA to have a working towards diagnosis. So talk to your disability office, talk about the working towards diagnosis. It means you get a letter from your GP saying that these thoughts have been going on, and you might be able to get, and I only say might be able to get DSA for that, in that kind of bridge. But also your disability office might have its own funding streams. And if they have a diagnosis of ADHD, as from last year, don't quote me on this, but I think from last year, you can now go and see an assessor and get an ADHD mentor, but we have no idea what they are and what they're going to do.
Thank you for that. One final question. What's next for your research?
Ooh. Well, first of all, I want to make sure that the research gets out there. And so part of that's going to be, there will be the academic papers. There will also be the quick things that are easy to read in between seeing students. I would love there to be some sort of network of mentors where we can share good ideas and practices. Bit of that will come down on funding. My immediate new research is about superior perceptual capacity and finding ways of nudging universities towards places of sanctuary and quiet and silence, because I think that would be good for us all, particularly if you share an office with me.
Thank you. I should just say it's an absolute pleasure working with you, and on the occasions that we share an office, it is wonderful. So I see that we're coming right to the end of our time, so I'm just going to thank you again for a really wonderful talk this afternoon.
It's been a pleasure and a joy.
And thank you all for attending. Such a great crowd, a turnout today, and I hope that we will see lots of you on some of the subsequent webinars that are part of our webinar series. Do follow us on social media. We always will post updates about all our events that we hold. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Take care.